No, not yet. Good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of the webinar. Now we are moving from Asian continent and focus predominantly but not exclusively on ports in EU and NATO member states. Additional context is the last Friday's European Commission's announcement that technical support instrument would also includes area of security in Hamburg, Rotterdam and Antwerp port. These meetings are organized together with Asia Research Center, our co-host, and I'm privileged to host this webinar with experts from various sectors. Currently, we have 3 speakers present, and I'm privileged to host this webinar with them. First of all, welcome to Dr. Franz Paul van der Putten from China Geopolitics. He's a researcher, but also active in business. Then we have also Mr. Vincent de Sadler, who is the Deputy Managing Director in Port Zoutbrugge Terminal. And also well known to our audience, Mr. Jod Gonen, who is a researcher in Maritime Policy and Strategy Research Center, previously also a diplomat and a consultant. We'll see if other panelists will join us. And I regret that I will end up with very brief introductions, given your outstanding professional biographies, but I would prefer to give more space for you to speak. And yeah, well, let's start with this strategic and geopolitical aspect, because it's probably very important for the audience. So maybe Franz Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, but I think we can actually, I see that Alicia is also already in the meeting.
Yes, nice to talk to you all.
Great to see you. Yeah, well, of course, I should introduce you as well, because you're representing so many areas from academia, Hong Kong University, but also business, Natixis and Bruegel think tank. And yes, I not only that I love to listen to you, but also you have this global overview and global perspective of Hong Kong's financial market. So please begin the discussion.
Katarzyna, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm not sure whether I should be the first speaker, to be frank, because I'm not an expert in this area, but I can just perhaps give a very general view of where we stand in terms of first China's ability. So first of all, where China stands in terms of dominance of the infrastructure in Europe and beyond, but also where China stands in terms of ability to maintain this push towards dominance of global infrastructure. So to that end, I will make use of a couple of projects that we have been working on, financed by the European Commission on this front. And here's very briefly our findings. First of all, in terms of China's dominance of EU infrastructure, you probably know that we know much less than we should at the European level. There is now a call by the European Parliament basically asking researchers to review this topic, because in many cases, China operates through leasing activities. I give you the example of the airport of Tirana in Albania, and there's many others. So we don't really have, first of all, a clear picture. There is another reason beyond the leasing that I want to mention, since you said, you know, that I may share some experience from Hong Kong. And indeed, the other reason is Hong Kong. Many of the companies to us are not considered Chinese companies, but they are Hong Kong companies. And the question is, you know, we can think of power assets, Hutchinson Port, you name it. So, you know, once you consolidate all of that, if you should, Australia does, for example, but we don't in Europe. So the picture starts to look much more populated, if I may say, in terms of China's presence in our critical infrastructure. But once we do that, and I think it's an exercise we surely should do as Europeans, I think we still are I think we could safely argue that compared to other areas of the world, certainly Asia, but even Latin America, perhaps we're not yet there. Now, the question is, can China continue to finance all of these infrastructures? And to me, what we see so far, when you look at the net lending capability of China. So if you look at most of this, by the way, in Europe is mostly direct investment, foreign direct investment from China, but in the rest of the world is mostly project finance. So China does not necessarily own, although they may have some contracts, underlying contracts, by which if the payment is not made, they may then, you know, use the infrastructure as collateral. But other than that, the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at the flows, both FDI, there's a new report by Rhodium clearly showing that the Chinese FDI into Europe is as small as ever. So the strength of the impulse isn't there financially, at least. And in the case of the rest of the world, not even lending is there. Chinese, actually, if you look at the data, Chinese net lending with the rest of the world is negative now. And the main reason for this is that countries are making repayments to China, and China is no longer continuing to lend. So what I'm trying to say here, and I end very soon, is that yes, China is in a way dominating, or at least being much more present in critical infrastructure globally, also in the EU, but there's a big question mark as to whether China can continue to do this, because its financial muscle is no longer as strong as it used to. And I end by saying that if you consider China's structural deceleration, our estimates are 2.4 by 2035 growth rate, GDP growth rate. Just imagine how hard it is going to be for China to continue to finance all of these projects all over the world. So I'm not saying that solves the problem, but at least it gives you a sense of dimension of how much can this continue. And I would still, and finally, really finally, advocate for Europe to really map China's presence in its critical infrastructure, whether it's transport, power, etc. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this great introduction. Actually, in the morning session, it turned out that Israel and Japan have independent mapping projects on that, and Mr. Gonen will most likely speak about it soon. But now I will pass the microphone to Dr. van der Putten, who is known also for his publications about Piraeus Spot and general China geopolitics.
Thank you, and hello everybody. I want to use the opportunity for my introduction to make some remarks on the relationship between cooperation with China in maritime ports in Europe on the one hand, and security risks on the other hand, because I think, well, this is of course the topic of today's of this panel, but it's also a topic that is very much relevant at this moment. There's a lot of debate about it. Very complicated topic. First of all, so when we talk about Chinese involvement in European maritime ports, I think it's more than just direct investment. So direct investment is attracting a lot of attention. But another big topic that is also relevant for security, for the security side, is the use of Chinese equipment. So this is not Chinese investment, but European ports using Chinese equipment like cranes, like for instance, container scanners. So this is also increasingly something to look into. And then when you talk about the investment in European maritime ports, very prominent is Chinese investment in container terminals. But of course, Chinese companies could also invest in other aspects of the port, other terminals and container terminals, storage facilities, logistics facilities, industrial activities in port areas, shipbuilding activities, various import services. So there's a lot of activities going on in maritime ports where Chinese companies can invest and where they actually often are investing. But I think for our discussion, investment in terminals and the usage of Chinese equipment is two main areas to focus on. And then there's a very specific case, which also should be mentioned, is Chinese direct investment in port authorities. This is something that there's only one instance in Europe, which is the Chinese investment in the Port Authority of Piraeus in Greece. But it is a very important reference point that is often mentioned, so it is also something to keep in mind. So in that context, how to shape, how to structure the debate and the perspective on the security risks on the one hand and cooperation with China on the other hand. Starting on the security side, I think two main risks to focus on is, first of all, the risk of economic strategic dependence on China. So are we, so individual member states, but the EU as a whole, what is the risk that China can use its leverage that it has because of its involvement in maritime ports to put pressure on individual member states or on the EU as well to achieve its economic or political goals. So that's one big risk, of course, and then there's the other big risk to focus on, I think, is especially data integrity and data security, because increasingly when we talk about port activities, there's a very big technological aspect involved, and this technological aspect is growing, and within the technological aspect, data plays a central role. So how can you cooperate with Chinese counterparts, with Chinese, how can Chinese companies be involved in European maritime ports without strategically sensitive data being compromised in some way? When you look at the balance between the risk side, so the security risks on the one hand and the benefits on the other side of cooperation, primarily economic benefits that we will think about, that usually are thought about. It's also important to realize that it is different for each particular instance of investment or each particular usage of Chinese equipment, how big the actual benefit is, the economic benefit. And it is up to the port authority involved or the EU member state involved or the EU as a whole to think how to maximize the economic benefit. So you can have Chinese involvement in your port, but then you need to make sure that this Chinese involvement corresponds with the strategic economic needs that you have as a port or as a country. What I'm trying to say is that it's not just a matter of allowing Chinese investment or not allowing it, but actually making sure that you use it in a way that is that maximizes the potential benefits. Finally, so I think the balance between the risk side and the benefit side, it's different for each individual case of investment. It's different for each port. And that is something then when you talk about the EU level as a whole, that makes it very difficult. I would say for the EU as a whole, yes, in principle, having Chinese involvement in European maritime ports can be good. We should keep in mind that also European companies are investing in Chinese ports, are involved in Chinese ports. So at least at that level, there's also a European interest that corresponds with the Chinese involvement in our side. So, in addition to focusing on this balance between risk and benefit, I think what is essential for the European Union, what needs to be done anyway, whatever the balance of that, the outcome of that assessment is, there needs to be a mechanism for coordination among the member states. I mean, at the moment, it is on the Chinese side, Chinese companies that operate within a framework that is defined for them by their own governments. And on the European side, it's individual ports that compete with each other. So it's really, I mean, essential that if China's involvement continues, if we wanted to continue, that something needs to be done there. There need to be at least some basic common criteria that the member states agree on how to deal with, how to assess Chinese influence, and there needs to be a coordination mechanism there. And then finally, my final remark is about the geopolitical level. In the end, and this corresponds to the usage by NATO of the port facilities, so the host nation support function that maritime ports have. Of course, a very important obligation that each NATO member state has within the alliance. And there the question is, where are we going as European countries in relation to the military aspect of our relationship with China? Is China becoming a military adversary at some point, or might China become such a military adversary of NATO at some point in the future? This is something that is possible. It cannot be ruled out. And I would say this is something that you can go two ways. You can say either as EU countries who are also NATO members, because of this potentiality, we don't want to have any kind of involvement of China in our strategic ports. Or you can go the other way, which I think is, for now, the more promising way, which is to make sure that as European countries, you are involved and you try to moderate, temperate the relationship between the US and China. Try to use whatever you can, influence you have to try to prevent the military conflict from breaking out between the US and China, and therefore limit the risk that we as European countries become involved in a military confrontation with China at some point. Thank you.
So much for those insightful comments, especially mentioning the data security issues, because then we can easily move to Dr. Tim Rolich, who just joined us, and actually who worked on involvement of Huawei and other Chinese high-tech companies. So I would ask him now to take the microphone.
Thanks so much. My apologies for being a bit late. I was caught in another meeting and didn't really realize the time it is. Ultimately, we are back to physical meetings, which does not have us having a clock always on the bottom right side. So my apologies, but here I am. I will somewhat repeat a few things that Franz Paul has said. I thought to sort of dig a bit into, as I'm sitting in Germany, here in Berlin, sort of have a very brief review of sort of the discussions we had on Chinese investments in the Port of Hamburg, in one of the container terminals, Tollerort, and speak also a bit about sort of the opportunities and the risk structure, how it has been discussed here, but also sort of what takeaways we could have from that, and sort of assess some of these arguments. I mean, maybe to start with, just to explain why this is such a crucial issue and why it has been really catching the attention of the wider public in Germany. After all, this is sort of just an investment in one port terminal, is I think that we need to acknowledge that 90% of global trade in goods is maritime. So that flows essentially through seaports. Obviously, not all of this goes through Hamburg port or through European ports, But sort of that, I think, is crucial if we sort of think geostrategically, what is the importance of seaports as such? And here, each port itself is just a small piece of a puzzle. But if you put those pieces together, you have the entire picture, and this entire picture really matters from the viewpoint. I'll get back to that, but I think that these numbers are important to bear in mind. The second, I think, is that and that already hints at something that Franz Paul has also mentioned, that ports, our seaports, are sort of relatively non-digital so far, at least in Europe, and that we sort of see a rapid development of digitalization at this point in Europe, and that Chinese actors are quite advanced on this if you compare sort of with Europeans and Americans and others. And I think both sort of the fact that so much trade in goods flows through seaports, as well as the fact that these important knots in the global trading system are undergoing a digitalization, which means that sort of more and more data is being collected, makes seaports a particularly important critical infrastructure that I think still has not the public attention it deserves. Now, sort of to jump into the German case and then draw a couple of conclusions from this and lessons from it. Just to 20 seconds of background here. Chinese state-owned shipping company COSCO decided it would like to take a minority stake in one of the four, actually the smallest of four container terminals at Hamburg Harbor. That container terminal's name is Toller Ort. It initially wanted to purchase 35% of that terminal. In October, after plenty of reviews by the investment screening reviews by government agencies, a takeover of 24.9% was being approved, which may sort of be slightly incorrect in terminology. So the government actually decided that anything beyond 25% or more would be forbidden. So the Chinese could not buy more than 25%. Then we had another sort of round of discussion whether to lower the threshold to 10%, but I'll leave you with the details because this is really just sort of bureaucratic domestic issues within Germany. If you're interested, I'm happy to comment, but I don't think it contributes sort of much beyond the discussion within Germany. These are just technicalities of German laws. But that I think sort of is sort of the background. What we have seen in the investment screening process is that the 6 ministries involved in this process have all disapproved of Chinese investment, of COSCO's engagement in Hamburg Port. So have German intelligence services and agencies being involved. In the end, it was Chancellor Scholz himself who, for political reasons, decided that this investment should go ahead. Now, what were sort of the arguments pro and con? So the opportunities, I think, very much reflective of what Franz Paul has said. One is sort of something that is very much tied to the vertical integration and the concentration of the shipping market. So what we are seeing is that fewer and fewer big shipping companies are handling more and more of the maritime trade in cargo goods. And at the same time that these, and that's what I refer to as vertical integration, are increasingly not just shipping lines, but also taking over port terminals, port terminal operations. And they redirect direct most of the cargo through the terminals that they own themselves. That has two advantages for them. One is they don't need to pay to third parties fees for using the terminals, and also they can be more reliable in their delivery since they can always prioritize the cargo of their own shipping line over that of others. So it lowers cost and increases reliability their services. But that implies, of course, that sort of the gravity of power who shapes this market segment is shifting from seaports and seaport operators to the shipping lines that become the operators themselves, as they are the ones sort of essentially deciding where to direct the cargo volume. And that implies, of course, that a harbor like Hamburg would find itself in a disadvantageous position if it did not allow for these shipping lines to invest. So practically speaking, what Hamburg saw during the pandemic was that when there were times with fewer cargo coming from China, that COSCO would essentially first use the port terminals it was operating already in cities like Antwerp, Rotterdam, Zeebrugge, etc., and not use Hamburg. And Hamburg would also be sort of only be in use in case these container terminals in other ports were already sort of excessively used. So in that sense, it was a matter of simply being competitive. Hamburg being competitive compared to Rotterdam, Antwerp, etc. The second advantage, I think, that that was discussed was that COSCO has enormous experience in digitalizing seaports. So turning Tollerport into a smart port sea terminal would probably be more successful, or likely be a success story with Chinese participation. Now, to the challenges, I think 3 challenges were put up that somewhat relate to those 2 opportunities. The first is sort of the flip side of the coin when it comes to the port, the vertical integration, and the fact that COSCO would now increasingly use Hamburg port, because that also comes with deepening dependencies instead of diversification that is supposed to be Germany's policy goal here. So cargo throughput from China increases in China. The privileged access that COSCO now enjoys as an owner of the terminal itself would actually disincentivize other shipping lines, Maersk, Müller-Maersk, others, to use Tollerport as a port terminal to operate their own cargo. So you actually deepen existing dependencies on COSCO. The second counter argument relates to the digital aspect, and this is that you develop technological dependencies. Many of the digital technologies that are being used in ports, you don't just buy, plug in, and then use for the time being, but they require regular maintenance. So they require regular access also by the supplier to those technological equipment, and thereby increase the risk of sabotage. So in a case of an escalation over Taiwan or any other sort of a major escalation of conflict between the West on the one side and China on the other, it would be relatively easy to essentially knock out Hamburg port simply by using the channels that those technology suppliers would need for remote maintenance work of those equipment. The second counter argument, or the third counter argument, but the second related to technology, is that involving COSCO could essentially serve as a panopticon. So what we see is that seaports are not just getting digitalized, but what we also perceive is an increase of connectivity of the seaport itself with the hinterland. So with all the logistical chain in the country, an increasing usage of big data and artificial intelligence to get much more effective, efficient in handling cargo. But that, of course, requires that one needs to very carefully regulate access and very carefully classify the sensitivity of data. And the perception is that from the practices in other seaports that this is normally not the case, that the levels of sensitivity for this are not high enough. And here the question is, what access would an owner, even if only having a minority stake like COSCO, have on data on the freight and logistical chains? And that could have two negative implications. One is commercial. So COSCO would have enormous advantages in terms of information about the operations of its competitors from other countries. So it could essentially use this knowledge advantage to be commercially more competitive and thereby more beneficial, and take over more market share, which again deepens our dependency on Chinese logistical chains. And second, it could have a geopolitical risk, as not the data from one seaport, but the combination of data from several European seaports could provide a more comprehensive perspective on bottlenecks of supply chains for Europe that China could use in the event of an escalation, of a geopolitical escalation. It could be Taiwan or anything else. Now, I'm already talking quite long, so I'll wrap up and sort of say just this. I think in the end, from my perspective, I'm certainly leaning on the critical side. I think it was the wrong signal to allow Chinese investment in this port after the Ukraine-Russia war, not least because it needs to be, such a decision needs to be embedded into the broader goal of diversification, of de-risking, and one should have not just taken sort of the singular local perspective, how competitive Hamburg is compared to Antwerp or Rotterdam, or other European seaports, but instead sort of rather aim for a European perspective and try to convince European partners to get a process going where China would essentially then de-invest from other European ports instead of doubling down and letting them into one of the terminals of Germany's main seaport. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for presenting your perspective, especially on digitalization issues. And we can come back to some of these issues in a moment. But first, now we pass the voice to Director Vincent Desadler, who is, we can say, has a perspective of sector of enterprises on the ground, on, let's say, first front. Please.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me express my gratitude to the Asian and Pacific Research Center for the opportunity to discuss here and elaborate on a very interesting subject. Indeed, I serve a life sentence in port industry, I feel. I've been active in various functions as chairman of port terminals, but also chambers, employers association, etc., etc. So I have seen together with you over the recent years the increasing trade growth between the Far East and Europe. We all witnessed the times of the double-digit growth, the initiative of the new Silk Road, the massive, as it has been highlighted by the previous speakers, the massive increase in investment in the container sector with giant vessels of over 23,000 TEU, and with it, indeed, the investment in ports, the investment in a layout of a feeder network to enter into hinterland logistics, which was mostly demanded also by the industry to have a larger responsibility in the logistics. We have seen the concentration of these global shipments into a few alliances, but most importantly, and that's the debate of today, we have seen the increased growing rivalry between US and China, Europe being in the middle. And I realize that I simplify, but I think it bears at least a thought to say that for me, all these allegations on security, cyber risk, spying, and even the tensions around Taiwan can be narrowed down to who is number one in global trade and who is the rival. We know that China does not want to be hampered or dictated in its trade ambitions, whilst US wants to remain on top. And the repetitive reports on threats spread into the media have led to a common belief that China is the wrong player and Europe has to choose West. And if you dare to put this into another perspective or another angle, immediately the media reacts with very negative reactions. I would like to give 3 observations. There are so many truths as there are 8 billion people on the earth. So I put very modestly, I'm not saying convictions, I put it as observations. The first observation is Europe has always believed in global trade. Global trade as a source of innovative supply at competitive price levels. Global trade also as a source of stability and shared wealth. And if we keep believing in this global trade, we should not be forced to be choosing markets excluding others. And I feel that lately this is more realized, and we see in renewed European trade talks with China some restoration of balance and bringing a rationing versus emotions and assumptions. One observation. A second one is, which was touched upon, the critical infrastructure. Indeed, aside from trade, there are sectors that need special attention and protection. And they cover strategic needs, and they need to be controlled by an authority. But then, as it is advocated repetitively, Europe should talk with one voice, one strategy, and not with 27 different opinions. It feels like an orchestra with very good musicians that all have a different play, and the conductor doesn't seem to be able to agree to one play to be performed. And that's a weakness of China, whereas China talks with one voice. Yeah. Lastly, if we talk into investments into ports, we all agree Piraeus is a different case. In the financial crisis, Piraeus was demanded by Europe to go for harsh conditions and to cure itself. In their way to solve it, they sold the Greek port to Chinese interests, who on their turn was in need of a hub in the Med. But the other investments into ports, are based on long-term concessions, call it leases, with terminals like Genova, Valencia, Antwerp, Rotterdam, Zeebrugge, amongst others. And over the years, all these terminals have seen a sustained major investment, a growth in throughput, and in fact, a contribution to the European economy and employment. These port infrastructure, as we witness, are multi-user activities, meaning that it does not only run for Chinese interests, but is at service to other customers that want to make use of the port and the terminal. Each project runs at its own cost and revenues and authorities. These selections or their projects, as they run it, are based on long-term trade strategies. And over the recent years, we have seen unprecedented challenges like the COVID isolation, the Ukraine war, the countermeasures against Russia, who has dried down all trade on the Baltic, inflation, and others amongst them. To address them, there's only one way, that's a long-term strategy. And we know that in China, they operate a different system. The MDs of large companies are also party members. But on the positive side, this means that important projects are assured of their fundings and hence a long-term confidence. This is in contradiction of what we too often hear when they meet a port to look at a project. Then it's, what does it give me next quarter? Come on, this is really too short-term thinking, and too short-term thinking results in missing opportunities, I believe, especially in the shipping industry, where decisions covers decades of time. So, as explained before, the Chinese investment in European ports are trade triggered. They are shareholders in port terminal companies. I do not believe that as the investment stands, and as a previous speaker, Madame said, it might well be that with the reduced growth, also the capacity to take initiatives in Europe reduces or diminish. But I do not believe that these capacities have any control on the port capacities in Europe. So these are the three observations that I want to share with you, and that might stimulate the further debate. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and experience. Now we'll move partially outside of the EU, but we're staying in the group of developed economies, but also we'll have a global outline of the port dynamics. Given the size of Gdańsk and Gdynia, it is relevant not only to analyze those grand behemoths like Antwerp or Hamburg, but also some middle-sized ports. So I will gladly pass voice to Mr. Jehut.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to share with you in a very few slides and very short presentation the case study of the Port of Haifa in Israel. Actually, we've been through this discussion and finished it about 5 years ago with a very pro-Western decision by the Israeli authorities, and I would like to go very briefly on the process and the situation in Israel. I think in some aspect it is relevant to Europe, in some aspect it doesn't, because we don't have the multilateral framework in Israel. So just let me share it with you, please. So you can see in the picture the computer sketch of the new port in Haifa by SIPG. So this is the city of Haifa. I'm sitting here in the university, the tower on the top of the city, and you can see over here, you can see the port. So the city is actually overlooking the port. So many aspects of espionage, etc., are less relevant in this context, because actually you can see what happened in the port all the time. So just a very short background on Israel. We are a very relatively small nation, about 10 million people, and we don't have any land trade at all because of geopolitics of the Middle East. So we are totally depend, 99% of our trade is via the sea, a very short shore of about 200 kilometers. And in those 200 kilometers, there are two ports, the port of Haifa over here in the north, and the port of Ashdod in the south, which are about 150 kilometers away from one another. We are also depend on the trade. About more than 80% of our GDP is international trade. So the government decided about 15 years ago to expand the current ports and built 2 new terminals, one in Haifa and one in the city of Ashdod. And there is some relevancy to the Greek issue over there. In Haifa, we didn't have the financial problem that the Greek had, but we had a very problem with a lot of problem with the union and the labor market. And some of the reason for the government to introduce new international operators were, among other things, on top of economic development, was to solve internal issue with the unions and with the labor market. So this is the situation. This was the situation pre the tenders. The 2 ports, both in Haifa and in Ashdod, were constructed parallel. So the tenders were issued at the same day. The winners of the tenders were announced at the same day. The construction of the 2 ports, which are very similar in terms of the capacity, the depths, etc., were going parallel. This is not owned by China, as the previous speaker says. The government owned the land. The government built the 2 ports, and then we're leasing for 25 years for an operating company the 2 ports. So the port of Haifa were issued to SIPG in China, and the port of Ashdod to TIL, a subsidiary of the MSC from Switzerland. So this was the situation, and this was the way that things were going. And the tender were issued in 2015. Just an aerial map of the Haifa. So this area over here on the right top is the new SIPG port. And what is interesting here, you see the entrance to the port, and all this area is the Navy port, and this is the 6th Fleet, the American, one of their ports in the Mediterranean. So the Americans are visiting this port as well. And anyone who sits here in the entrance can monitor whoever goes in and out. And we'll have to refer again to the first picture of the mountain. So everything is in the port is very, you can see what happens over there. So this is just to give the background. And now there was a tension in Israel between the economics, developing the port, developing the economics, solving internal problem as the unions and the working labor and the labor issues in the ports. And this was the dominant motivation of building the ports until 2018, giving again the fact that the tender were given to the companies by 2015, 3 years before. So until 2018, it was hardly in the public debate. There was hardly any notes in the media about the 2 ports. And everything was very commercial and logistic oriented. In 2018, I think the American woke up with looking at the big picture, as was mentioned before, over here, looking at the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative as a whole. There was a visiting Israel, Minister Pompeo, then the Secretary for the Trump administration. And from this point and onward, things were reversed, basically. And the security establishment, which is very substantial in Israel, were against the ports and against any other Chinese investment in Israel. A committee to review foreign direct investment was founded. We didn't have any committee like this before, since we are very, very open economy that depend on trade and investments. And basically, from this year onwards, I would say that all major FDI from China into Israel stopped. There are some other FDIs in the technology in startup. So just to summarize the case of Israel, I think some of the previous speakers said that Europe is stuck in the middle between China and Israel, and China and the US. Israel definitely felt that it's stuck in the middle. Not like Europe, we don't have the security net of 27 countries. We are quite alone in our region, depend on the US. And we choose very strongly the American side. And I guess that the major flow of Chinese investment into Israel stopped even before the corona. So basically, that's the case study that I wanted to present. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that was a very, very precise and detailed case study. So we can see a perspective from different ports. And I know that you're knowledgeable of different areas. So if you have additional questions and comments, especially towards other, feel free to address it now, and I'm opening floor to the discussion. If today's experts do not want to add anything, I would open floor also to questions from the audience, preferably in the chat. And already we have the first question. Well, then one is military mobility is high on the agenda on the 10 network revision. May it help to set standards to regulate Chinese equipment at critical infrastructure facilities. And also, second one, it's mostly to Dr. Rudolph. As you mentioned, European ports are relatively undigitalized. Recently, Hawaii has launched a fully autonomous port terminal in Tianjin, and are we facing a risk of China setting global standards in the maritime industry 4.0?
Yes,
Of course, I'm dedicated to experts, but all of you are more than welcome to comment.
shall I begin to address the first part then of the question? Well, so whether the 10T network revision can help to set standards. Yes, well, I don't have a definite answer to that, other than that I think that is a very useful idea. It is one of the instruments or one of the possibilities that is already in place. So I would say yes, let's look into that and see if that can be used to help create standards and to work towards more coordination.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yeah, I mean, this is spot on. It's we are facing sort of the situation that Chinese suppliers, technology firms, Chinese seaports are ahead of us in terms of digitalization. We also see that it's hard to circumvent using Chinese equipment, regardless of investments by Chinese operators. So that is indeed sort of an issue. So even if that is certainly sort of a discussion to have, to what extent the investment is the crucial aspect here. And I think it's a natural development that technology leaders are also setting normally the standards. To what extent sort of standard setting is a risk or not is something that we have to discuss. In the end, technical standards are to a large extent effective to the degree that they are picked up by the market. So that I think requires sort of some deeper investigation to what extent that is a risk and in what ways it is a risk. I do want to sort of say two very brief notes in response to some of the other presentations. One is sort of the sort of underlying accusation that this is all about sort of that all the discussion about diversification is ultimately about decoupling, seizing all trade with China, and I absolutely don't see sort of where this is coming from. I mean, I hardly see anyone in Europe who wants to economically decouple. It's also not necessary. So it's really about addressing macroeconomic risks and risks to national security. And seaports do play a critical role as a critical infrastructure in that. It's not that there should be no Chinese engagement whatsoever. It's always sort of a matter of where precisely the risks lie, to what degree we depend on China, and that's I think is where the discussion goes. The second is the question, to what extent, and this is frequently being brought forward, to what extent is it important who owns the land? And I think this is just a traditional perspective on critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure today is very much digital. So I may own the bridges, I may own the land, I may own the streets in a seaport, and I may still lose control over an important element of critical infrastructure. in the 21st century. So that is something I think that is not will not convince in the near future those decision makers that have to decide on that. Maybe final note, that port investments make economic sense, and that we sort of lack commitment in Europe to make those investments and make things happen is indeed really a major issue, I think. So it's not to put all blame on China. It's us normally not doing sort of the homework that we have to do. But this is not, so that should, for policymakers, not sort of be an argument in favor of allowing risks to appear.
Thanks so much. Are there any questions and comments on the first? Because we have another remark, and also two more questions come. One is that, well, that to develop more about Chinese FDI in Israel after 2012. And the question is whether they stop completely in all sectors after the date. Is the Chinese company still operating in the port of Haifa to this day? And the second question is the process of greening shipping industry an opportunity for European logistics operators to regain some grounds vis-a-vis COSCO? And of course, all of you are welcome.
We just talked with some clarification on Haifa. So yes, the SAPG won the tender in 2015 for 25 years. So they are operating the port as for now for 25 years. And in 2018, 3 years after the tender was granted to SAPG, the government established a FDI review committee. And basically with this committee, major Chinese investments were, I would not say blocked, but they didn't materialize in the area of infrastructure, energy, etc. So we left only with Chinese investment in the area of high technology as in startups, etc., but not in infrastructure or other big investments of those kinds. And if I may just note for the other previous speakers, I do think, if I may say an opposite opinion, I do think that who on the ground is important, because we're talking about physical trade here, and we're talking about physical ships. And of course, it's the digital, and the data is digital, and sometimes the operation of the crane, etc., it's all remotely. But still, there is an issue of boots on the ground, of who is actually in the ownership when the goods moving in, with the ships going in. So at least from my perspective, I think it's maybe less critical, but it's still a major issue with the investment model. If this is an investment model as an operator, or this is at the port authority level and owning the ground, it's the land itself. Thank you.
If I may make a comment, there was a question about Europe. Could Europe not take the lead to make the shipping greener? I think that is correct. Europe has good in research and developments there, has good projects to work in that field. But as I said previously, we should clear the table of any how to say assumptions, and work with facts, and then find out where do we really stand. To the previous speaker, I'm not saying that it is European policy to erase the European markets. That's not what I want to say. But I mean, the media is controlling the mind. And so with the population, the people, the general widespread idea nowadays is don't be in favor of China. China is the bad player, as I said. This should be over. We should have a more rational discussion on it. What I see that is happening in Israel, I was not aware, but I see it as a clear example of an unbalanced force to be choose to take part is. And you know, in our global world, our world is a threat. There are enough conflicts. We as experts have to take the role to diffuse all this, but stick to what is really important. And you know, best to make the shipping more greener. Our planet is a threat. We must be able over the whole world to work with research and development with the best in class, whatever technology it is. I am totally unaware of, or I'm not at all an expert in digitalization. Others are, but we should bring down, for example, Huawei technology. Where is the threat and where is it best in class? And then work with the best in class, and same with Europe. I must say, we are the lead with initiatives on green deployment, but China does not stand still. If I see what is happening with the electrification of cars, electric cars, at the moment we speak, thousands of Chinese cars are being imported into Europe, fully electric or hybrid, and with extremely good quality. So there also, there are possibilities, but nobody stands still. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much. I can see Professor Herrero is raising hand.
Yes, I'd like to add a comment on this idea that we need to be rational on our comments on China. And I think the main thing I want to say is that we should also talk about reciprocity. I'd like to know how many ports in China Europeans control. I guess the answer is 0. And this is something that does not equate the fact that we want to work with the best technologies, because if we were to be able to work with China's ports in China, that would already be quite good in terms of, you know, basically exchanging best practices in technology. I see no reason, and this is not about the media or, you know, being tough with China, to be able to argue that this has to be a one-way relation. And that's what I wanted to say regarding the ports.
Well, thank you so much. We can pass to two more questions. The first one is that the question arises whether we could not create a kind of platform in Europe for the exchange of experiences in cooperation with the Chinese side, so as not to make mistakes on either side and use mutual experiences. So it also is related to what Professor Garcia Herrero just said. And also the second question is, I still would like to hear a bit about the political context of this all in terms of global dominance perspectives for China, if possible. Please choose the question you would like to cover.
Can I say something about the two questions? I think it's the suggestion to create a European platform for exchange. I think it's a very good idea. I would really be interested in developing this idea further. I think, of course, there is already exchange. I mean, there is a European port association, and there's also, of course, in Brussels, exchange between member states and the European Commission. But I think that a platform that would also involve European experts or experts on European ports from various disciplines, that brings together the experts, the ports themselves, and the governments. I think that would be very useful to exchange ideas and experiences, and also to work towards common approach. So I think in addition to the need for a European level strategic framework to deal with Chinese involvement in European seaports, I think this would also be something that would be a good step ahead. And then about the other question, global dominance perspective for China and how this relates to the topic. So in my view, there are two main aspects on the risk side that are important. The one is related to technology and data, and I think Tim gave a very good explanation of how this works and how important this is. The other one is strategic dependence, and I think strategic dependence is not the issue so much at the level of individual member states. I don't think individual member states, through Chinese involvement in their ports, will become dependent to such an extent that China can create a lot of leverage on those countries. But looking at the bigger picture, so the EU as a whole and the longer term position of Europe in the world and its relationship with China, there I do think that this is something that the strategic aspect is very important, that it would not be favorable for the European Union if the Chinese government reaches a point where it can control the major flows of goods between Europe and the world. So where Chinese actors can have a major impact on whether or not these flows reach Europe and whether and how they are divided among European seaports. So there, I think, in the longer term, the big picture, that's a very important aspect for Europe to pay attention to.
Much now, Professor Garcia Herrero.
Yes, I'll be very brief. First of all, I want to second the proposals which Franz Paul has just made, and I would like to add one more, which I mentioned at the very beginning of my statement, which is that I think Europeans should know which critical infrastructures are controlled by China, because there's no such information at the moment that is easily available. And I think that's a big problem. It should be more transparent. We should ask our port authorities, our transport authorities to be able to unveil that information more easily. That's all from my side.
Well, then I maybe just add to, because there was this question to elaborate a bit sort of on the political risks. I mean, so in sort of the political context, the main, I think what we need to bear in mind is here that we discuss also more in the context of risk scenarios. I mean, geopolitical tensions is not a new risk as such, but I think if anything, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has sort of demonstrated that things can take turns that are quite different from what we want to see, and that has enormous economic repercussions. And effective sanctioning mechanisms, they always come with enormous cost unless you have a very detailed and good understanding of the bottlenecks and where you can target your adversary. So the broader you need to, the fewer information you have, the broader you need to design sanctions against your adversary to make sure you actually hit the other side. But that also comes with enormous economic cost yourself. And I think that's the main use that detailed information can have to either threaten your counterpart or to actually put it effectively into practice and making sanctions as least costly for you as possible, but as effective for your adversary. And that is why data and a good knowledge of trade in goods, of dependencies, of supply chains is extremely valuable. And I think that is sort of the context from which to, so we're speaking here of an unlikely scenario, but of one that has enormous damage. And I think these are the two factors that you need to factor in when calculating risk. How likely is it to materialize? And if it does materialize, how damaging is it? And I think it's not so much the likelihood, it's more sort of the enormous damage that it creates that is essential here. And just one comment sort of on a discussion we are having here, sort of how important is digital infrastructure or physical infrastructure. I'm not saying that physical infrastructure isn't important, but that is relatively easily to confiscate in such a high risk scenario of escalation. What you can't easily confiscate is the knowledge that your technology supplier has maintaining your digital critical infrastructure. That is what sets digital infrastructure apart from physical infrastructure. Physical infrastructure you can simply confiscate much more easily. Not saying that it does not come with any implications whatsoever, but that's why I think focusing on the digital is so important.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any additional questions. If there are some final remarks for any other experts, we have some room for that. If not, we can just say that, well, it was an enormous pleasure to listen to you, and also thank you for all your statements. Also, we could see we had a very active audience, so thanks for all the questions. And I think it was a really important contribution to our knowledge here, what's going on in the world and also in the EU. So it was not only an honor, but really a great pleasure to listen to you. Thank you so much. And I think we can stop here. Waiting for the next time.